All right, everyone. It's now been announced that the U.S. Role in Syria is now an indefinite thing. That is to say that the few troops, thankfully few, that we have in Syria as this attack on Idlib continues. Erdogan's like, oh my goodness, it's terrible. We need a ceasefire. We need to talk about this. Putin's involved. Iran is involved. Assad, the FSA, ISIS is there. Al Qaeda is there. We're basically backing them at the time, which is very, very strange. The U.S. is involved. Israel is involved. It seems like all the major players over every proxy war in the Middle East for the last half century are converged in Syria. Rather worrisome. Trump, under these conditions, has decided, well, the deployment of the troops we have in Syria, instead of ending it, which was initially something that he optioned. I think there's like, 1,000 U.S. troops at some bases there, sort of cross-training with the Syrian rebels and doing various things. They're going to be there for a very long time. So this is basically a smaller version of Iraq, where we still have thousands of people there. They're not in an active combat role. We're not technically in a war within the context of Iraq anymore. Sort of similar to Afghanistan, most of the fighting is, occasionally a guerrilla attack by some dudes out in the hills or something like that. As far as the actual central government, insofar as it exists, goes, we're allied with the Afghan government. We're also, oddly enough, working with the Taliban, which is like, strange bedfellows, I suppose. I oppose this. I opposed going into Syria in the first place. I oppose continuing involvement. I oppose continuing involvement in most of the Middle East. Now, there are a few nations there that sort of welcome us, and they're like, yeah, we're long-standing allies. Like, we have a presence within Turkey. Those bases have been there for a long time. We have, significant amount of trade and diplomatic relations. You've got a government that's becoming more totalitarian, but traditionally Turkey's been, more westernized style. Hopefully, by continuing diplomatic relations, we can nudge them in that direction and stave off Erdoganism, or whatever you would like to term it, within Egypt. We have a presence within Egypt. Egypt is an ally. They control the Suez. It would be crazy not to have a presence there. Insofar as Syria goes, though, the government doesn't want us there. It seems like the majority of the remnant population doesn't want us involved. They're probably already tired of having to deal with the Iranians, the Russians, the Turks, the FSA, ISIS, Israel, and all of these other players basically wandering around at a whim within a country that wouldn't have had that situation, that the failed state status that allows other powers to simply march around in another sovereign nation's territory. That status would not have been in effect were it not for the fact that the U.S. was exacerbating the Syrian civil war by arming the FSA. I oppose doing anything with regards to Idlib. I oppose doing anything with regards to staying in Syria where we're not welcome. The troops that are there are exposed to potential danger. They could be hit by chemical weapons. And that's the other part. It looks like we're gearing up for a war, and that's what really troubles me. Because we've got all of these statements, if Assad uses chemical weapons, or it looks like he's going to use them, he'll face major repercussions. The UN gets involved, and then sort of NATO being invoked. I am still extremely skeptical that Bashar al-Assad is stupid enough to deploy chemical weapons on an area he has already surrounded, in which he outnumbers the opponent 10-1 and has the backing of not only the Iranian forces in the region, but the Russians. He's already basically wiped the FSA out in most areas. ISIS is now basically an afterthought. They've basically melted back into the sand dunes. Why on earth would he devolve into committing limited-scale genocide against pockets of civilians when he's already basically got the handful of rebels in there exactly where he wants them? It doesn't make sense. Again, it's the same propaganda used against Trump. One-dimensionality. The concept is Assad is irredeemably butcherous, completely insane, a brutal, utter, despicable warmonger, despite the fact that he, throughout his tenure there, never really hauled off and attacked anyone unprovoked. Therefore, if there's a chemical attack, it could only come from him. Now, we know that at least in the first instance of the use of chemical weapons, it was the FSA that had deployed it, either unknowingly by shelling an area that was stocked with chemical weapons, or by deploying them themselves on purpose, probably the latter. The FSA deployed nerve gas in the first instance. At the time, it was swore up and down by our government and by the UK's government, asking for strikes on Assad at the time, of course. They said it was Assad that did this. Only Assad would do this. He's nuts. We've got to do something. The plan was shot down. The U.S. Congress made it clear to Obama, not going to happen. The U.S. people overwhelmingly opposed strikes. The same was true in the U.K. The House of Commons and the people of the U.K. denied the government's desire to do so. I think the French ended up getting kind of involved anyway. Later on, weeks and weeks later, after, Obama backs down and Cameron backs down, then we learn, oh yeah, according to the UN's own reporting, they can't determine that it was even Assad that gassed anything to begin with. So it was the anti-war element of these societies was correct. The problem is that through a concerted effort in multiple countries, it appears that the warmongers are trying to convince people slowly over time to be generally in support of the idea that Assad is simply a one-dimensional caricature, that he has no redeeming qualities, he really is stupid enough to gas a pocket of civilians for no apparent reason whatsoever in order to actually cause the world powers to attack him. I don't believe that. I simply don't think so. I think that it's an attempt at regime change, and it's failed consistently. Assad has managed to hold on. He held on long enough so that the Iranians got involved. Situation improved long enough for the Russians to get involved, and now basically, unless there's some major false flag incidents that the West can cook up, there's no longer any justification for getting rid of Assad, Saddam style. We already saw, by the way, what this kind of foreign policy leads to. We did this in Iraq. He has chemical weapons, he's using chemical weapons, he's planning to destroy Israel and attack his neighbors and do crazy things. He's nuts, and the people there will thank us as liberators. Where have we seen this basic story before? So I don't want to have any presence in Syria. I don't want to have any presence in most of the Middle East, save for Turkey and Egypt and any other country that desires us there, in which our troops are safe. Because we've already seen what happens with our Middle Eastern foreign policy when we've got these pockets of people there and the UN gets involved and all of a sudden we start headhunting after some dictator. You can oppose the concept of an autocratic government without thinking that it necessarily is an improved situation if the US gets involved, sticks its dick and stirs it around in Syria, gets rid of Assad. I think it would make Syria 10 times worse. I think that we took what fundamentally was a developing economy. Syria was beginning to develop. It was beginning to get better over time. Liberalization will automatically occur in such a regime over time anyway. It had nothing to do with liberating Iraq. Same story. Iraq was beginning to take its first steps towards westernized development. It would have eventually liberalized. The idea that we invaded Iraq to oust Saddam for some liberating purpose or to protect people against WMDs that didn't exist in the first place is nonsense. It was done for economic reasons and is part of the grand chessboard involving Russia and the Cold War. You think that they had any illusions? 9/11 was fundamentally used as a way to begin surrounding Russia without the Russians suspecting a thing because the Cold War officially was over. And so they didn't get nervous when a bunch of US troops poured into Afghanistan and Iraq, two areas Russia originally, like a decade before, had wanted to control. They didn't suspect anything. They're like, oh, well, the Americans just got slamma-jammed. Of course they're going to go into these places. And they're telling us that Saddam had something to do with 9/11, which he didn't. I'm surprised they didn't claim the same about the Syrians and Bashar al-Assad. No, really, it was George W. Bush's own allies, but we'll talk about that separately since it's 9/11. So I figured this was kind of a fitting video because it is sort of like Eve of Destruction mode. And by the way, just the fact that I trust Trump a lot more than Obama or Clinton or George W. or Herbert Walker on foreign policy, the fact that we've had 4 shitty presidents in a row and Trump is the first one since Reagan to at least try to do a good job on foreign policy doesn't mean that I suddenly abandon my principles and say, okay, it's okay if Trump does it. I would have a problem with Obama or W or something trying to occupy Syria forever, but it's Trump, so I trust him. No, I trust him more on policy. But I still believe it's immoral. I still believe it's fundamentally a bad idea. And think about it. Let's say that I trust Trump completely and I'm like, well, I don't think he'll start a war. I trust him not to do that. Okay. What about the next president? You've already set a precedent for having a bunch of U.S. troops in the region and wanting to get involved. All the warmongers chomping at the bit. What if the next Republican president is a George W. knockoff? What if the next Democrat is someone like Hydrogen Hillary, wants to go to war to show that she can be one of the boys? I guess you'd have a problem now, wouldn't you? You'd end up collapsing the whole region. That's about all. Peace out.